Hey Defenders, welcome back. In this video, I want to show you guys how we can use Shuffle to detect anomalies within our alerts. So in this video, we're going to use a Shuffle workflow to detect when a user successfully logs into one of our servers from an abnormal IP address. And an abnormal IP address being a source IP address that they have not logged in from before. This could be a good indicator that somebody has gotten their credentials compromised if all of a sudden they log in from somewhere halfway across the world. And we're going to build a workflow within Shuffle that can detect that. So our goals for this video, we will first need to send successful user logins to our Shuffle workflow. So again, we will capture successful user logins with Wazoo, and then using our Shuffle integration, we will tell Wazoo when you see this particular alert fire, I want you to send this data out to our webhook that will be listening within our Shuffle workflow. We are then going to cache our username and the user IP that was associated with that rule. So a really cool feature within Shuffle is the ability to actually store a data key and value. So essentially what this allows us to do is build a database of keys and values, and our key being our username and then our IP address being our values. So under the hood, Shuffle will use the OpenSearch container that it's running to actually store these keys and values. And that'll become a little more clear as we go along with it. But it's a really awesome feature because now we're able to detect new occurrences that happen amongst these keys. And the keys in our example here will be our usernames. We will then detect when a user logs in from a new IP, again, using that cache node. And then we are going to correlate the country with an IP address by calling out to IP info as part of our workflow. And so the steps that we are going to follow in this video, we are first going to configure our webhook so that we have an endpoint for Wazoo to send this alert out to. And then we're going to build a workflow that stores the user IP along with the username. We are then going to geolocate the IP address to see what country that IP address belongs to. And then we're going to create an alert within the Hive that says, hey, a user has logged in from a IP address that we haven't observed them logging in from before. So stick around and let's jump into it. And all right, so first things first, let's go ahead and create a workflow. I'll just call this anomaly. I'll say user logins. And I'll go ahead and submit this guy. And we'll get taken into our logins here. And I'm going to go ahead and first we need to set up our webhook. So I'm going to go into triggers. I'm going to drag a webhook over and I'll just call this receive user logins. And I am going to start this guy. I'm going to copy our webhook URI here, and then I'm going to go into Wazoo to tell Wazoo, hey, I want you to trigger this when a user has successfully logged in. So first, let's find that user successfully logged in rule. So if I open up my terminal and log into this guy, I already have a Wazoo agent deployed onto here. So now we should have just triggered a successful user login. So if I go ahead and refresh my Kibana here, let me actually change it to the last 15 minutes. We get our authentication success. And here I can see that I am coming from Austin, Texas, user root, and here's my source IP address. So I'm going to tell Wazoo, hey, anytime you see the rule ID 5715, which is associated with a authentication success login, then I want you to send that data to our webhook. So I'm going to go ahead and go into management, go into configuration, and I'm going to edit our manager configuration. And I'm going to scroll down, and I already have this in place. I'll put this in the description of the video. Actually, it'll probably gripe at my opening and closing. So I will link to this in our GitHub down below. And I'm going to paste that URI. And here you can see the rule ID that I'm saying that will trigger the call out to this webhook will be 5715, which again correlates right to our authentication success. So that looks good. Go ahead and save that guy. and I'll restart our manager. And while that's restarting, I'll go ahead and change this node to repeat the details that it gets back from the webhook. So that we can use it for our other nodes within our workflow. So I'm going to erase the hello world. I'm going to select the plus, which will just be auto completion. I'm going to select the execution argument, and I'm going to go ahead and change that name to just repeat webhook. And then I'm going to save that guy, and hopefully the manager should be restarted by now. Yeah, that looks good. All right, so let me go ahead then and log in again, which will trigger this rule again, and we should get some data in our webhook here. So I'll go ahead and refresh this a few times. And there we go. We got our data. So our Wazoo manager sent the alert to our webhook, and now our second node is repeating the results. So if we go ahead and parse this out, we see all of our meta details associated with this alert. So here we see authentication success. And then if we scroll down a little bit, we'll see our two fields that will be of interest of the to us, right? So we get our, within our data block here, we have our destination user, which is the user that logged into the box, and then the source IP associated with this user. So that was me, of course, logging in as the root user and the IP address that I came from. So let's go ahead and actually now cache these values, cache this value. So if I go into apps, I'm going to drag over my shuffle tools, and that'll connect to our repeat webhook node. And for my find actions here, I'm actually going to select check cache contains. And now you'll see where our key and our value will come into play, right? So for my key, I want that to be my username, which in this case will be root. So I'll go to my repeat webhook. I'll scroll down until I find the field data.dstuser, and you can see in the last execution that value was root, which is correct. So I'll set that there. And then for my value, I'm going to set this to the source IP field, right? Because that correlates to the source IP address that I logged in from. So what we're going to do every time this loads, this is going to check the value and see if it's been associated with the key before. So it'll check the value, the IP address, and associate that with the key, which is the username. And if it exists, then it won't do anything. But if it doesn't exist, then it's going to add it to its cache table, and that's what this append equal to true is doing. So if we go ahead and save this, and so if we go ahead and kick that off again, we see it running through. And if we look at the results for our, actually, let me change the name of this. I'll just say store username and source IP. Right, so go ahead and save that. And then if we look at our latest execution here, we'll see exactly what's happening. So we see our key value being again associated with our username, which is root. So our key, and then it gets assigned the value of our IP address that we logged in from. And since this is the first time that this ran, you can see our found is set to false because it didn't already exist. So it added it to our table here, which is really awesome. So now if, say, for example, I run this again, since it already exists, it'll find that it already exists. And here we say found was appending, but item already exists. So telling us, hey, this already exists, which is really awesome. So let's say I change this IP address to, so here I am now on a different server. Let me expand this out a little bit. So we can see that this server has an IP address of this 162, and I'm actually going to SSH onto the box that our Wazoo agent exists on, and this will result in another IP address logging in as the root user successfully. So let me grab the IP address of this guy, the 78 box, and if I go to the second server, I'll say SSH, and let's log on to this guy. I'll say yes, and I will provide my password, and now we have successfully logged in from this IP address. From this IP address of 162. Should have a webhook just kick off again, and it looks like it did. So now if we scroll down, let's look at the repeat webhook, which we should see our new IP address. And yeah, okay, good, we do. So our 162.251. So we saw me successfully log in. So that looks good. And now our store username and source IP should have just ran to actually add this new value to our key. And look at that. So we now see my new IP address has been added to the value table, and we see appended as it didn't exist. So this is a new IP that the root user has successfully logged in from, and it was now added to the table. And so now we can do some anomaly detection with this, right? If user Bob is always logging in from the same IP address, and then all of a sudden he logs in from a different IP address, this will now store that. And now we can get a little more advanced by looking up, for example, the country of this IP address. So let's actually go ahead and do that. So I'll go ahead and add an app here, and I will search for the IP info. I'll go ahead and drag this guy over and connect him to run after our IP address is stored. And what I'll do is I'll say get IP geo info. Let me add my authentication, which I've already set up, and I'll call this get country. And for our IP, I will say again, I will grab what's from our repeated webhook. I'll scroll down and I will select our source IP. And then I don't need to add any headers or queries, so I'll go ahead and save that. And let's go ahead and run this. So now, after our IP address is added to the value of root within our data table here, if it doesn't already exist, then we will get the country from that. Then we will get the country associated with that IP address. So let's go ahead and save, and we'll go ahead and just rerun this guy. And so we see again our check cache contains app run, and here it says found was a pending but item already exists, right? Because Shuffle has already added this valued IP address to this key of root. So that's correct. And then if we look at the output from our get country, if we expand this guy out, we can now see the geo details associated with this IP address. So we see that this server is associated within Dallas, Texas. We get the country being in the US, time zone, and some other metadata in terms of the coordinates, which is pretty cool. So now we could then look at the country of this IP address and say all of a sudden, to tune out false positives, we allow US countries, but we really want to be alerted if this is like China or Russia or Thailand or some other country that we know that this user should not be logging in from, right? So let's build a little more logic out with this, right? So let's say we only want the geolocation to run, because right now this will run every time, whether this value has been associated with this key or not. So every time this workflow runs, this API call out to IP info is going to run. However, let's add some logic and let's only have our IP info API, our IP info node run if found is not equal to true, right? So meaning that this is a new value associated with this key. So in our example, this is a new IP address that has logged in as the root user. So if I select my arrow here, we can add a new condition. So what I'm going to say is I'm first going to do not, because I want this to progress to the next app if it is not equal to true. So I'll select my autocomplete, and my name for that node is store username and source IP. And I'm going to be looking at the found field, right? Because if we look, the data that I want to look at is within found here. So I'm going to add the dot found to tell the condition, hey, I want you to look at the value that's associated with the found field. So Let me get back into my condition. I'll autocomplete. I'm going to say not. I'll say dot found. And I'm going to say is not equal to true. So that would mean that this is a new IP address that has logged in with this root user. So I'll go ahead and submit. And we see our condition being, if I can move that, there we go. We see our condition being associated there. And so now if I rerun this guy, it won't get the geo IP information because this IP address was found. It has already been added. So it has already been added to our key. So if I look at show failed or skipped actions, we see that this guy was skipped because failed condition true equals true. So let's go ahead and change that. So our IP info did not run. So let me, instead of having to spin up more and more servers for IP addresses to log in from, I am actually just going to change these values here. I'm going to change this value here statically. So I'm going to set this to an IP address of just, I'll say 8.8.8. I'll change my IP here to 8.8.8. So I'm changing, relying on the data from the webhook because this will allow me to easily change the values associated with to different IP addresses. Otherwise, I'd have to keep spinning up servers or have some tool that falsifies that spoofs my IP address, and I don't feel like digging into all that. So I'm just gonna take the easy way out and change these statically. So I'm gonna go ahead and save that guy. So what'll happen now is, because this 8.8.8 will be associated with our root user, this will be a new IP address associated with our root user. And so this condition will be false because it was not found before. So that means this is a new addition, and then we're going to go ahead and do that geolocation. So if we go ahead and rerun this guy, we should see that kick off here. So we see our webhook, which blah, 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 we don't care about. So we see, so stepping through this, we see, hey, we get a value of false, right? Because this was a new address. And so it added it. So it added our 8.8.8 IP address to our value list here. And then if we look at our execution, we see the get country was ran because our condition was to pass to the next node succeeded, right? Because dot found was not equal to true, it was equal to false. So then we go ahead and do the geo IP of this data, and here we can see that this is Google's DNS server. So pretty cool. So we're starting to make some progress here. Now let's cache the country, because IP addresses that users are logging in from can change pretty often. What would be more of a red flag would be if all of a sudden they logged in from a different country, right? That would be something that's interesting. So let's go ahead and do another shuffle tools, and we're going to use the same action of check cache contains. So go ahead and set that. Let me actually go ahead and name it, and I'll say cache country. And the cache is kind of a misnomer because the data doesn't reset after every time the workflow executes. So this is stored permanently until we were to wipe this out ourselves. So it is actually stored for the long term, but it is called cache. That may not be the best name for it. That may be a little confusing, but just know that this data is persistent. It does not get removed for every workflow or at the end of the day or anything like that. This data is persistent. So keep that in mind. So our key, so since we want to cache the country, let's go ahead and associate this with, let's go ahead and associate our key again with our username. I'm going to scroll down, and that'll be our DST user, which will be root. For my value, I want to associate that with what our IP info returned back to us, right? So our get country app. So going to expand that, and I'll hover over our get country, and then I want to grab the country. So I'll go ahead and select that and save that off. And let me grab just a random IP address here, and Set that for my value there and here. And let's go ahead and save and run this guy now. And so now we should get the country that's associated with that IP address back. And then we should then store that country with that associated username, which in this case is root. So if we expand that, we see that it has stored the country code of US with our root user. So if we look at our get country that ran last time, we see that that IP address was actually associated with Houston, Texas. And we grabbed the country code of the US and stored that within our table as well. So now we can see that. So now we can say, okay, I want to try to whittle out false positives because users can change their IP addresses that they're logging in from. But if all of a sudden they logged in from a different country, then I would want to, let's say, create an alert within the Hive. So let's go ahead and create that. So I'll bring in the Hive and I will connect that to this node here. I will say create alert incident. I'll just call it abnormal source. I'll just call this all abnormal. And then my source reference, I'll just say incident dash. And then let me grab just the timestamp associated with this. So I'll hover over repeat webhook and I'll say just this all fields timestamp. For the title, I'll say user logged in from abnormal country. And let's get the value of the country, which would be, so I'll hover over get country and then I'll say country. And that looks good. And I'll put a severity just of 3 here. All right, so I'll go ahead and save that. Now let's actually add though a logic because I don't want it to create an alert every time this workflow runs. As of now, that's what'll happen. I want to do something similar to what we did with our get country, saying, hey, I only want this to run when a new value has been added, when a new source IP has been seen logging in, where in this case, I want to do the same thing. I only want create alert to run when a new country has been observed from this user logging in from, right? So we're going to go ahead and add a similar condition here. So going to say, I'm going to select this specific arrow here. I'm going to say new condition, and I'm going to follow the same logic. So I'm going to say is not equal to, and then I'm going to say cache country, and then dot found equals true, which since we're negating with this exclamation point, this will say it is not equal to true, meaning that it has not seen this country associated with this user, with this username before, and is adding it to the table and tells us that this is a login from a new country. So I'll go ahead and submit that and save that off. And let me actually make sure I get an IP address that would be a new country. So this just generated random ones. So I'm gonna look up their country codes here. Okay, here's one from Canada. So this should trigger an alert for us here. So I got that IP copied. And let me change my values there of that IP address. I'll say there and there. And save that. And let's go ahead and run this guy. And now once this runs, we should get an alert within the Hive. So it looks like our store username and password is running. So this, it pinned it as it didn't exist because this is a new IP address. So that looks right. We then saw the get country run. It associated it with Canada. So that looks right. We then cached that country. So it pinned it as it didn't exist. So if we then scroll this down, we see the country code of Canada, which is the CA, be added as a value to our root key. And then we see our alert be created because this found was set to false, meaning this hadn't existed before. So if we then go into the Hive, we see our alert, user logged in from abnormal country, and then we just include the country code at the end here, right? So pretty cool. And if we run that again, just showing you how we now are whittling out false positives. So if we run this again, our condition to go on to the get country app, the get country node will fail, which will result in our new alert not being created because our IP address was already found, right? It already existed. So because we don't want to spam ourselves with alerts every time someone logs in from the same from an IP address, either the same or from the same country, right? We don't want to spam us with alerts. This is a good way. We have our conditions here to detect that for us. So let's go ahead and run through that one more time. So let me grab another random IP address and let's see where this guy maps to. Hopefully it's somewhere we hadn't seen, none detected. Australia. Okay, so that should be a good one. So I got that IP address copied. I'll go ahead and plug that into my value there and into my value here. Go ahead and save and rerun this. So now this will be a new IP address, right? So it'll get added, which in turn will have our Geo IP app run, which should map it to Australia, which will be a new country that has been observed for this user logging in. And so our Hive alert should now be created. So if we start to step through this, we see appended as it didn't exist, and we see that IP address is 110. We then look at our get country, it mapped it sure enough to Australia. And since Australia has been a country that we hadn't seen before, we added it to our country table, right? So our AU here. And now our alert was created because these were not found before, meaning that they are brand new. So now if we go to the Hive, we see our Hive alert, user logged in from abnormal country. So pretty cool. So we're able to do some anomaly detection actually with Shuffle, which is awesome. Uh, we're able to build essentially data stores for with and we can associate keys with various values, and you can get really sophisticated with this, right? This is just one basic example that is hopefully useful for you guys. This is useful for me. It's awesome. You can store, you can really whittle out false positives and really create high severity alerts on some abnormal behavior, right? And this abnormal behavior being we are now able to detect when a user has logged in from a country that they have not logged in before, which also helps with false positives, right? With our conditions that we have here. So we're not just spamming ourselves with user logged in alerts. We are building some intelligence onto our initial authentication success alert with our Shuffle workflow. I think that wraps it up for today's video. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next one.